Thank you all very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be a participant in the visit of so many distinguished scholars from Tsinghua University. As Carrie said, I'm Samuel Otter, currently chair of the Berkeley English Department. What I'll do today is briefly introduce the two participants. We'll hear a paper, a response, and then open it to questions. The name of this panel is History and Fiction as Narrative, a Chinese Perspective. And our speaker is Cao Li, professor of English, deputy director of liberal education at Tsinghua University. Her research interests are 20th century English and American literature, post-colonial criticism, and liberal education. She is the editor and author of several books, most recently Dreams and Dialogues Between Civilizations, which she co-edited in 2009, and The Idea of the University and the Humanistic Spirit, which she co-edited in 2006. The topic of her paper will be History and Fiction as Narrative, a Chinese Perspective. Responding to her will be my colleague Stephen Lee, who joined the English department this past fall, 2009, and we're delighted to have him. Professor Lee received his PhD from Stanford University in the Modern Thought and Literature program. He wrote a dissertation entitled Multiculturalism versus Multinationalness, the Clash of American and Soviet Models of Difference. Before he came to Berkeley and after he got his degree, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the United States and the Cold War at New York University. So it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome Cao Li, who will deliver her paper, History and Fiction as Narrative, a Chinese Perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends. Today I'm going to present a paper entitled History and Fiction as Narrative, a Chinese Perspective. I'll just read the paper aloud. In the first few decades, the literary quality of historical narratives and the historical quality of literature have been considerably recognized and debated in both China and the West. The debate in China, however, actually evolves into an issue about the relationship between historical representation and new possibilities for the Chinese writer to write fiction in the Chinese language at the present time. A significant number of novelists, though in subtly different ways, have produced impressive works in an attempt to open up new ways of representing the past as well as the present. While much of the discussion in the West of why contemporary writers are writing historical novels has been confined within the discussions of empire or women, or to the debate between escapism and relevance. To cite A.S. Byatt's observation, the debate and practice in China appear to complicate the Western paradigm a little. The Chinese writer tends to be more interested in exploring personal and local narrative modes in the overall context of Chinese modernity, through which history as well as literature can be articulated. Their exploration is not only about the relationship between history and literature as narrative forms, but also about reimagining China in response to the notion of modernity and the trends of globalization. My presentation today mainly takes the years Coloratura, in Chinese it's called Hua Qiang, as an example to illustrate the contemporary Chinese writers' efforts in regenerating historical imagination and thus expanding the aesthetic scope, and structural capacity of historical narrative in fiction by way of Chinese experience and perception. For many contemporary Chinese writers, traditional or classical Chinese literature and Western or world literature jointly form the two mirrors against which the Chinese writer sees himself. They actually become both resources and pressures for the contemporary Chinese writer to write with or write against. The Western writer appears to treat the novel as history despite its fictionality. Milan Kundera observes in his famous The Art of the Novel that the novel is a vehicle of European culture because the history of the novel and the history of European culture are inextricably bound together. Marx described the English realists of the 19th century, Dickens, Thackeray, the Brontes, and Gaskell, as novelists, here I quote, whose graphic and eloquent pages have issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. Engels developed a similar thesis when analyzing the works of the great French realist writer Balzac. When writing about Balzac's The Human Comedy, Engels noted that Balzac gave the reader a most wonderfully realistic history of French society, from which even in economic details, for instance, the rearrangement of real and personal property after the revolution, I have learned more than from all the professed historians, economists, and statisticians of the period together. While in China, speaking of the relationship between history and novel, or 小说 in Chinese, the divide between the two is clearly drawn as early as the East Han Dynasty. In the Treatise on Literature, Book of Han, by the historian Ban Gu, he wrote, "The school of story writers involved most probably from small officials," in Chinese, small officials, here is 拜官, who composed stories out of the street rumors and gossips that they have heard. Their works served as supplements to the historical works by the officials of history, 史官. While the official of history is supposed to write true and objective histories, the story writer has the freedom of composing histories according to what he thinks he saw and felt. Similarly, the distinction between literature and history is made clearly in Aristotle's powerful plea for the superior value of poetry over history, as he makes the famous remark about the distinction between the two. Here I quote, "The poet's function is to describe not the thing that has happened, but a kind of thing that might happen, i.e., what is possible as being probable or necessary. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history, since its statements are of the nature rather of universals, whereas those of history are singulars." Aristotle's philosophical defense of poetry offers an answer to Plato's attack on poetry as imitation, not of reality, but the appearance of reality, and therefore as concerned with the third remove from truth. In the 20th century, general poetics of imitation regarding both fiction and historiography was defined by Erich Auerbach, the German literary historian. His principal volume bears a characteristic name, mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature. Auerbach's insistence that great literature is responsive to historical circumstances earns the mode of literary criticism in which mimesis operates the name of historicism. Heavily indebted to Vico, Auerbach appreciated what Isaiah Berlin refers to as Vico's anthropological historicism. The notion that ideas involve, that knowledge is not a static work, a static network of eternal, universal, clear truths, either Platonic or Cartesian, but a social process. Mimesis as a concept, then, cannot be limited to a fixed definition, for it necessarily changes according to the demands each age places on its literature. Auerbach's argument that mimetic standards shift from age to age, that verisimilitude is an evolving concept, is of significant relevance to the discussion of a number of Chinese contemporary writers who rewrite and represent history or histories from a present-day Chinese perspective. Some most prominent examples would be Chen Zhongshi's White Deer Prairie, Zhang Wei's Ancient Boat, September Fable, Su Tong's The Poppy Family, The Diaspora in 1934, Li's Coloratura, Yu Hua's To Live, Wives and Concubines, Liu Zhenyun's Hometown Chrysanthemum, Mo Yan's Sandalwood Punishment, Li Rui's Old Address, Liu Hen's Green River Daydreams, Ge Fei's Face Like a Peach Blossom, Mountains and Rivers Asleep, and Wang Yi's Reality and Fiction. All in their own distinctive style, explore the relationship between history and the narrative forms. A significant difference is made by them in terms of narrative perspective from which history is represented. Generally labeled as avant-garde literature and new realism, their works dismantled the myth of grand narrative of history. They are to be read not only as narrative experimentation, but also as a contribution to the general debate about literature and history in the world, and about the rewriting of Chinese history at home that gained momentum ever since the late 1980s. In the rest of the presentation, I will examine this prominent phenomenon through analyzing Li's Coloratura, which emerges as a complex and inextricably intertwined involvement of fictive elements in reconstructing history. Li published Coloratura in 2001 after 10 years of composition. Immediately after its publication, the novel was hailed as a breakthrough and one of the finest and pioneering productions of the Chinese avant-garde literature. Saturated with parody, pastiche, intertexts of seemingly true historical documents, pseudo-archives, and invented interviews, Li made his way to a new platform of rewriting history. Coloratura starts with an abrupt claim as of, "I will speak what I have to speak," and ends with a famous cliché as of, "History is written by the conqueror." It tells a fragmented life story of a revolutionary intellectual by the name of Ge Ren, a homonym of the Chinese word for the individual. Against the historical background of the Chinese Revolution, in the first half of the 20th century. The narrative traces the journey in search of the protagonist, Ge Ren, whose reported death in an anti-Japanese ambush became a question when he was detected still alive and writing his autobiography at the foot of the bleak mountain. As a result, he became a game hunted by both the nationals and the communists. Both sides would hunt him to die either for the honor of a claimed anti-Japanese national hero, that's on the communist side, or for rejecting being converted to the side of Kuomintang. That's the motive of the other side. Major aspects of his life are comprised of his childhood, his love affair, and his political and literary pursuits, all pointing towards the individual destiny in the ups and downs of the revolution. The structure of the novel is composed of a main text and a subtext. The main text, marked with the sign @ is comprised at like an email address at. It is comprised of 3 oral accounts by the 3 narrators who, in the author's own words, witnessed Ge Ren's history, participated in the making of that history, and retold that history. The subtext marked with and, the sign and, which suggests a plus or a paralleled narrative, is weaved by the I narrator, who is somehow a descendant of Ge Ren. The time span covers the May 4th movement, the Yan'an rectification movement, the anti-Japanese war, the national communist corporations, the Cultural Revolution, and the end of 20th century open-door reform. What is unique about the novel is the intriguing arrangement of the 3 narrators, plus the insertion of the 4th narrator, I. While each of the 3 narrators has a special identity and plays an important role in Ge Ren's life and death, the 4th narrator, who is apparently identifiable with the author, is the real controller of the action, though he appears very earnest and objective, trying to get the truth out of all the myths by citing conversations, comparing notes, presenting various historical documents and archives. The use of pastiche and collage is common in contemporary historical fiction, both in China and in the West. Nonetheless, what Li Er appears to be most interested is maximizing the lively and rich capacity of the Chinese language through a particular use of pastiche and parody in the most hilarious and creative way. As the author weaves all these narratives into a large and intricate textual fabric, the reader feels the tension between different historical memories and the narratives, as well as a relaxation owing to the author's humorous use of the easygoing and radical style of conversational Chinese. The reader can hear different people speaking in different voices, either corresponding to or transgressing the political and cultural characteristics of their times. While the first narrator's subtext sounds cool, objective, and honest, the 3 main narratives are crowded with cliches and buzzwords of various historical periods, cross-referenced and used in various circumstances. Such well-known historical remarks and claims, and some of them made by country leaders, as only people are the creators of history. Women can hold up half of the sky. The minority should obey the majority. White cat, black cat, whoever catches a rat is a good cat. Stability should be dominant of all, center around economic construction. Thrive the country through science and education. Steward beef with potatoes, that's a kind of symbolic aim of the communist society. And isn't Cui Yongyuan, the CCTV host, doing Speak the Truth and Speak It Truly program? 就是那个实话实说那个中央台的节目。When the reader intoxicates himself with laughter in the pleasure of reading all these foregrounded remarks, the author has already successfully smoothed out the borderlines between history and literature, fiction and truth. Although each of the three paralleled narratives stands by itself, they are set in both complementation and contradiction with one another. While this gives the opportunity or excuse for the fourth narrator to come in and intervene, the device enables the bringing out of an important message. That is, the problem and the possibility of knowing the truth is linked with the way of the world and the nature of the human being. Although the three narratives center around the revolution and the revolutionary intellectual, it is more about humanity, individual value, and human nature. The status quo of the narratives are bound up with the narrator's attitudes and conscience. Ge Ren's relation with the revolution is historically destined. The Chinese intellectuals then, like Ge Ren, were most likely to engage themselves in the revolution one way or another. His experience in Japan as an overseas student, his close relationship with Chen Duxiu, Li Dazhao, and Qu Qiubai anticipates his joining Yan'an as a young revolutionary. However, he is at the same time an intellectual and a poet. Like the traditional Chinese literati and officialdom, 中国的士大夫, who are concerned about the well-being of both the nation and the self, Ge Ren was eager to understand and fulfill himself as an individual. His name, Ge Ren, is indicative of this point. If writing is both a mirror and a lamp, to borrow Abraham's terms here, through which one comes to know about oneself and the outside world, Ge Ren's poem, Who is the Original I?, may suggest that the existence of individuality is an unavoidable question in all circumstances. How can one come to know oneself? How can one prove the existence of oneself? Are questions he addressed in the poem, which ends with the line, Who crushed the mirror into pieces and turned I into numerous eyes? Coloratura seems to hint that the later Ge Ren longed for a life that will enable him to enjoy the freedom of an independent writer. And this actually has a kind of overtone of Marx's statement about the freedom and development of the individual is a precondition of the freedom and development of all. If fiction can supplement history, Hua Qiang can be read as something in between the two. With all those seemingly read and convincing documents, archives, records, memories, interviews, and research findings, the novel looks like history in the form of fiction. Yet, because it is all fictional despite the so-called historical facts, it is therefore still a fiction even if it wears a mask of history. However, the question is, why does Lear do this? In an interview, when asked why he named the novel Coloratura, which in Chinese can mean telling beautiful lies or making skillful talks, he gave two answers to the question. First, it means telling lies in a beautiful and clever way. Second, it hints at the toughness of good writing, because in order to be a coloratura soprano, the singer here, the literary historian, has to be strictly and well-trained. He has to write good writing. On several occasions, Lear emphasized that his experiment with coloratura does not aim at setting up a true and beautiful paradise, but rather is an attempt to return to the historical site through which he can express his understanding and cognition of the past as well as the present. To him, writing such a fiction enables dialogues between different branches of knowledge and people of different backgrounds and allegiances. And one of the missions for the contemporary Chinese writer is to name the time he lives, like what Leo Tolstoy once did to the 19th century Russia, naming the unnamed experience by way of re-examining the past in connection with the present through careful evaluation and creative writing will give meaning and shape to both the historical existence and the ongoing process of Chinese modernity. Lear's rewriting of history, especially the Chinese revolutionary history, is therefore part of the general trend of rewriting China, which is characterized by a replacement of class struggle by struggles between individuals, as in Gefei's 大年 and Liu Hen's Green River Daydreams, or between family clans, such as Liu Zhenyun's hometown chrysanthemum. Such rewriting is termed as rewriting in a new Enlightenment context by the contemporary literary theorist Tao Dongfeng. It forms a reaction or counter-narrative to the so-called pure revolutionary narrative. The core of it is writing about the revolution from the perspective of human nature and humanity, while representing the problematic past and somehow deviating from the orthodox narrative of the revolution. The historical novelist attempts to reconstruct and revise the ideological narrative of history and the devitalization of personal experience. It expresses a desire for both individual and cultural redemption. When the central hero is replaced by the ordinary peripheral people whose individual life and existence become the focus of narrative, the grand history is subverted by small histories. The collective consciousness is complicated, if not completely substituted, by private concerns and individual desires and wills. In this light, we may say that that similar to the trajectory of the Western new historicist, post-colonial and feminist historical rewriting, there is a political as well as a cultural agenda behind the literary agenda in the contemporary Chinese writers' project of representing history. Throughout the history of Chinese modernity, from the late Qing dynasty to the present, both external pressures, mainly from the West, and the split of Chinese tradition from within gave rise to the complicated situation of modern China. This is, in turn, bound to induce new forms of fiction, since fiction is both a mirror and an intervener of history. With the belief that the Chinese way of modernity is far more complicated than that of any other countries in the world, the Chinese contemporary writer feels compelled to redefine and reimagine the new possibilities and alternatives of historical narrative. In this light, Lier's Bakhtinian dialogic form of narrative may best reflect the multiplied and complicated historical reality. A singular or linear historical perspective would not be able to convey the complex and diversified conflicts then and now. This is why Lier claimed that Coloratura is, like many other avant-garde historical novels in China, is meant to activate and rebuild the relationship between literature and history, and to recast the connection between the novelist and the reality. That's the presentation. Thank you.
Paper. We'll now hear a response from Stephen Lee, and then we should have time for a few questions.
Well, thank you for that wonderful paper. And I suppose just in my comments, what I'll try to do is try to I guess discuss your paper within a larger context. I guess towards the end of the paper, you really specified the specificity of the experience of Chinese modernity, and there seems to be an assertion of Chinese modernity as more extreme, perhaps, than other forms of modernity. What I'd like to assert is that the history engaged in Coloratura has global implications, has implications for everyone around the world. And I have in mind particularly the history of international revolution that's so, it seems, so intricately engaged in the novel. I think that the rise and fall of socialism, which seems to be the undercurrent of this novel, is something that interests me, certainly, but I think has political implications again, all around the world. I guess to make that observation a bit more specific, I was very excited actually at the start of your paper when you talked about this novel and the Chinese contemporary novel as a means of interrogating Chinese modernity and Chinese globalization, or notions of modernity and trends of globalization. And I think these two distinct terms are very interesting, and I think it would be interesting for me to hear how these particular terms are related and interrogated in the novel. It seems to me that notions of modernity in China must bear some relation to China's experience with socialism. And perhaps what we find in this novel is an attempt to revisit that history of socialism in China, the rise and fall of this history, this catastrophic history of revolution and the collapse of revolution. And indeed, by your account, it seems that the novel seems to be a dismissal of the revolution, a way of asserting human nature and questions of human nature that supersede, that outlive perhaps questions of collective consciousness, questions of socialism, of the revolution, the political content of the revolution in particular. And from the history, from the, I guess, the rubble of this history, it seems emerges globalization, a term which you mentioned at the start of the paper, but not you don't so much engage, I guess, throughout the paper. And so it seems that globalization in the context of China would have to involve somehow a kind of a refutation, a kind of disavowal of socialism, of this history of socialism in China. And yet, on the other hand, perhaps globalization might be seen as the continuation, merely the continuation of Chinese modernity. What this leads me to wonder, actually, is whether or not in discussing Chinese modernity and the history of socialism that accompanies that term, in sort of presenting Chinese globalization as the continuation of Chinese modernity, whether or not we might be able to redefine globalization, which in the 1990s, I think especially in the West, was largely associated with liberal democratic capitalism. If it is the case that there might be a way of blurring these two terms, modernity and globalization, might it be possible to bring in considerations of socialism, to somehow relate questions of socialism and the decline of socialism to questions of globalization? That is to say, can we perhaps use the experience of Chinese modernity to question the linkage between globalization and liberal democratic capitalism, and perhaps discuss globalization vis-a-vis socialism? Again, by your account, it seems that mostly these novels, these contemporary novelists, and Coloratura in particular, is mostly a disavowal of this experience, of the experience of socialism. And I guess one way in which, at least in my mind, we might sort of engage these questions of, well, the relationship between modernity and globalization, the question of how do we deal with socialism, how do we engage socialism, the history of socialism in China through this novel, is by looking at, I guess, socialist realism. I found myself wondering as I was listening to your paper whether or not you might be able to situate the novel within, I guess, the tradition of socialist realism in 20th century China. As a scholar, as a partial scholar of the Soviet novel, I found myself wondering if perhaps there is a kind of formal engagement with the socialist realist novel through the contemporary Chinese novel. In the socialist realist novel, we have a sense of progression from a state of spontaneity to a state of revolutionary consciousness on the part of the positive hero, and this progression is meant to sort of correspond with a certain account of history. The idea of history is progressing from feudalism to socialism, from feudalism to capitalism to socialism, and then to communism. Might we find traces, I guess, of this genre, I guess we can call it, in the contemporary Chinese novel? Or is it the case that the novel completely suppresses that history? And do we have instead, I guess, what might be called the postmodern novel instead? Your account of Coloratura reminded me actually of accounts of the postmodern historical novel, novelists such as E.L. Doctorow and his account of the radical tradition in America, the use of pastiche, of parody, the emphasis on I guess, identity and the kind of schizophrenia that you detail, I suppose, that seems to pervade the novel. Is this again a kind of complete disavowal of, the tradition of Chinese literature in the 20th century and an embrace of the, I guess, the Western, perhaps, postmodern novel?
Not absolutely so.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
maybe we should get started.
Have you finished?
Well, I have a few questions here and there, but I think my main concern actually is, how do we I guess, engage perhaps, or for me, how might I learn more, I guess, about the tradition of Chinese literature in the 20th century by looking at this novel? And are there perhaps echoes of this more, and perhaps more than just a suppression, I guess, of this tradition of, again, socialist realism and this history of Chinese socialism?
Well, thank you, first of all, for your comments. I would not say that Coloratura is a complete disavowal of Chinese, what you say, socialism. Because socialism, in terms of Chinese context, socialism is definitely a very important part of modernity. This is how we look at the novel from a social perspective. And on the other hand, talking about modernity or globalization, I think they also has a consideration of the identity of Chinese writer as a writer who can kind of like talk or make dialogues with the writers in the West by looking at things from a Chinese perspective. So it's not a complete disavowal of the Chinese realist socialism. Only, I think, the writer tries to complicate both diagrams, both the Chinese socialist realism paradigm, okay, and the Western post modern paradigm by adding something different, just to add a different perspective. I don't think it's a complete disavowal, both in terms of the social project and the literary project.
And could you elaborate on that, actually, how specifically this kind of dual engagement might be present, I guess, on one hand of I guess, postmodernism, and on the other hand of socialist realism, which opens up as well the rather annoying question: is the postmodern post-socialist, or is the post-socialist novel the postmodern novel? Which might be the case, but I guess to make this less abstract, I mean, could you, I guess, talk about that more?
You mean some
the specific engagement, I guess, with I guess the tradition of socialist realism, and also the engagement with the postmodern novel.
In terms of structure, I think, narrative structure, it's very postmodern. But in terms of the subject matter, it is still about a very specific historical period in Chinese history. And the use of pastiche and parody and intertext are definitely post-colonial narrative techniques. But he wants to present a different side of Chinese Revolution by placing the focus on the fate of the individual, because realist socialism used to write about the revolutionary cause, disregarding what would happen to the individual and how the individual take the revolution and its aftermath. But in this novel, he's particularly concerned about the individual's own feelings and his own choice, because all his friends around him who tried to kill him at the same time want to actually to save him, save him as an international hero. But he actually towards the end of the story, he rejected. He doesn't want to be saved. Because he was also suffering from a very serious TB disease, and he was disappointed about his kind of individual existence because of the ups and downs of the revolution, and his personal life, his love affair was kind of dramatically affected.
We have about 5 minutes, so let me see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes.
Many thanks for the wonderful lecture and the brilliant comments. My question is for both of you. You say both history and literature are highly connected in the sense that they express the mainstream of ideology. For one example, history is highly selective in its facts, and literature is highly selective in its details. Do you think so? Can you summarize the question?
Summarize the
Oh,
question.
the question is about how the two participants in the panel see the relationship between history and literature. And one example that was given was a narrative selectivity in both.
Would you like to respond first?
Narrative selectivity.
I think neither of you has to take that particular example,
Right.
but the general question is what binds, what separates history and literature in this kind of discussion.
I particularly, I enjoy and I find valuable looking at history as a way of opening historical possibilities, which is, I suppose, informs why I sort of was interested, I suppose, in interrogating the history of socialism, and more specifically, perhaps seeing if something from this history might be revived or salvaged, I guess. Because I guess the kind of dominant narrative of after socialism comes globalization, I guess my ulterior motive would be to use literature to somehow complicate that and to sort of see if instead we might question, what socialism might mean, what globalization might mean, and perhaps revisit this history again, maybe to salvage it. To use fiction to sort of again, to revisit, to work through the questions of this devastating history, I think, is something which I find quite fascinating and which I find just so wonderful about this talk.
That's right. You have observed that both literature and history may be very selective and even biased, but the two things do supplement or complement each other because literature can express something fictional, and if something is fictional, it's poetic, it can be a higher truth according to Aristotle, and history can be selective, and especially because how do people approach history through texts. And texts can be very much selective, and because the historian's point of view is affected by his either political allegiance, even his historical taste, his attitudes towards history, or toward the context in which the things happen. So that's why Croce says that all history is contemporary history. So.
George Starr?
In the course of your fascinating talk, you alluded in passing to Kundera, and it started me thinking about that whole phenomenon under socialism in Eastern Europe, where the novelist, instead of writing directly about the present in a
Right.
straightforward mimetic fashion, goes off in one case into fantasy, but a novelist in that situation who feels that history has itself become fantasy, history has itself become an exercise in creative imagination, naturally says, I'll write historical fiction. And it's a form of asserting the interchangeability between what he's doing and what the supposed official historians are doing.
That's right, yes. And for instance, that many people who know about the Three Kingdoms, not through like real historical books, but through the novel about the three kingdoms. That's yes. So history and literature do interchange, and you can either, special literature, sometimes step in to intervene the reliability of history.
I think we should actually end there. The next panel begins in 10 minutes. It's on Marxism and Confucianism today. I encourage you all to stay. There'll be a reception of about 10 minutes, that is 10 minutes between now and the next panel. But let's thank the two participants again.